Chapter 7. It was in the windless days of a perfect December that Molson, the Egyptologist, found us out and paid a flying visit to Helouan. His duties took him up and down the land, but his time seemed largely at his own disposal. He lingered on. His coming introduced a new element I was not quite able to estimate, though, speaking generally, the effect of his presence upon my companion was to emphasize the latter's alteration. It underlined the change and drew attention to it. The new arrival, I gathered, was not altogether welcome. "I should never have expected to find you here," laughed Molson when they met, and whether he referred to Helouan or to the hotel was not quite clear. I got the impression he meant both. I remembered my fancy that it was a good hotel to hide in. George Isley had betrayed a slight involuntary start when the visiting card was brought to him at tea time. I think he had wished to escape from his former co-worker. Molson had found him out. "I heard you had a friend with you and were contemplating further work," he added. He changed the word experiment quickly to the other. "The former, as you see, is true, but not the latter," replied my companion dryly, and in his manner was a touch of opposition that might have been hostility. Their intimacy, I saw, was close and of old standing. In all they said and did and looked, there was an undercurrent of other meaning that just escaped me. They were up to something. They had been up to something. But Isley would have withdrawn if he could. Molson was an ambitious and energetic personality, absorbed in his profession, alive to the poetical as well as to the practical value of archaeology, and he made at first a wholly delightful impression upon me. An instinctive flair for his subject had early in life brought him success and a measure of fame as well. His knowledge was accurate and scholarly, his mind saturated in the lore of a vanished civilization. Behind an exterior that was quietly careless, I divined a passionate and complex nature, and I watched him with interest as the man for whom the olden sun-worship of unscientific days held some beauty of reality and truth. Much in his strange book that had bewildered me now seemed intelligible when I saw the author. I cannot explain this more closely. Something about him somehow made it possible. Though modern to the fingertips and thoroughly equipped with all the tendencies of the day, there seemed to hide in him another self that held aloof with a dignified detachment from the interests in which his educated mind was centered. He read living secrets beneath museum labels, I might put it. He stepped out of the days of the pharaohs, if ever man did, and I realized early in our acquaintance that this was the man who had exceptional powers of resistance and self-protection, and was, in his particular branch of work, unusual. In manner he was light and gay, his sense of humor strong, with a way of treating everything as though laughter was the sanest attitude towards life. There is, however, the laughter that hides other things. Molson, as I gathered from many clues of talk and manner and silence, was a deep and singular being. His experiences in Egypt, if any, had survived admirably. There were at least two Molsons. I felt him more than double, multiple. In appearance, tall, thin, and fleshless, with a dried-up skin and features withered as a mummy's, he said laughingly that nature had picked him physically for his job, and indeed one could see him worming his way down narrow tunnels into the sandy tombs and writhing along sunless passages of suffocating heat without too much personal inconvenience. Something sinuous, almost fluid in his mind, expressed itself in his body too. He might go in any direction without causing surprise. He might go backwards or forwards. He might go in two directions at once. And my impression of the man deepened before many days were past. There was irresponsibility in him, insincerity somewhere, almost want of heart. His morality was certainly not today's, and the mind in him was slippery. I think the modern world, to which he was unattached, confused and irritated him. A sense of insecurity came with him. His interest in George Iseley was the interest in a psychological specimen. I remembered how, in his book, he described the selection of individuals for certain functions of that marvelous worship, and the odd idea flashed through me, well, that Iseley exactly suited some purpose of his recreating energies. The man was keenly observant from top to toe, but not without his sight alone. He seemed to be aware of motives and emotions before he noticed the acts or gestures that these caused. I felt that he took me in as well. Certainly he eyed me up and down by means of this inner observation that seemed automatic with him. Molson was not staying in our hotel. He had chosen one where social life was more abundant, but he came up frequently to lunch and dine, and sometimes spent the evening in Iseley's rooms, amusing us with his skill upon the piano, singing Arab songs, and chanting phrases from the ancient Egyptian rituals to rhythms of his own invention. The old Egyptian music, both in harmony and melody, was far more developed than I had realized, the use of sound having been of radical importance in their ceremonies. The chanting in particular he did with extraordinary effect, though whether its success lay in his sonorous voice, his peculiar increasing of the vowel sounds, or in anything deeper, I cannot pretend to say. The result, at any rate, was of a unique description. It brought buried Egypt to the surface. The gigantic presence entered sensibly into the room. It came, huge and gorgeous, rolling upon the mind the instant he began, and something in it was both terrible and oppressive. The repose of eternity lay in the sound. Invariably, after a few moments of that transforming music, I saw the Valley of the Kings, the deserted temples, titanic faces of stone, great effigies coiffed with zodiacal signs, but above all, the twin colossi. I mentioned this latter detail. Curious you should feel that, too. Curious you should say it, I mean. Molson replied, not looking at me, yet with an air as if I had said something he expected. To me, the Memnon figures express Egypt better than all the other monuments put together. Like the desert, they are featureless. They sum her up, as it were, yet leave the message unuttered. For, you see, they cannot. He laughed a little in his throat. They have neither eyes nor lips nor nose. Their features are gone. Yet they tell the secret to those who care to listen. Put in Iseley in a scarcely noticeable voice. Just because they have no words, they still sing at dawn, he added in a louder, almost a challenging tone. It startled me. Molson turned round at him, opened his lips to speak, hesitated, stopped. He said nothing for a moment. I cannot describe what it was in the lightning glance they exchanged that put me on the alert for something other than was obvious. My nerves quivered suddenly, and a breath of colder air stole in among us. Molson swung round to me again. I almost think, he said, laughing when I complimented him upon the music, that I must have been a priest of Aton-Ra in an earlier existence, for all this comes to my fingertips as if it were instinctive knowledge. Plotinus, remember, lived a few miles away at Alexandria with his great idea that knowledge is recollection. He said, with a kind of cynical amusement. In those days, at any rate, he added more significantly, worship was real, and ceremonials actually expressed great ideas and teaching. There was power in them. Two of the Molsons spoke in that contradictory utterance. I saw that Iseley was fidgeting where he sat, betraying by certain gestures that uneasiness was in him. He hid his face a moment in his hands. He sighed. He made a movement, as though to prevent something coming. But Molson resisted his attempt to change the conversation, though the key shifted a little of its own accord. There were numerous occasions like this when I was aware that both men skirted something that had happened, something that Molson wished to resume, but that Isley seemed anxious to postpone. I found myself studying Molson's personality, yet never getting beyond a certain point. Shrewd, subtle, with an acute rather than a large intelligence. He was cynical as well as insincere, and yet I cannot describe by what means I arrived at two other conclusions as well about him. First, that this insincerity and want of heart had not been so always, and secondly, that he sought social diversion with deliberate and unordinary purpose. I could well believe that the first was Egypt's mark upon him, and the second an effort at resistance and self-protection. "If it wasn't for the gaiety," he remarked once in a flippant way that thinly hid significance, "a man out here would go under in a year. Social life gets rather reckless, exaggerated. People do things they would never dream of doing at home. Perhaps you've noticed it," he added, looking suddenly at me. "Cairo and the rest, they plunge at it as though driven, a sort of excess about it somewhere." I nodded in agreement. The way he said it was rather unpleasant. "It's an antidote," he said, a sub-acrid flavor in his tone. "I used to loathe society myself, but now I find gaiety, a certain irresponsible excitement, of importance. Egypt gets on the nerves after a bit. The moral fiber fails. The will grows weak." And he glanced covertly at Isley, as with the desire to point his meaning. "It's the clash between the ugly present and the majestic past, perhaps," he smiled. Isley shrugged his shoulders, making no reply, and the other went on to tell stories of friends and acquaintances whom Egypt had adversely affected. Barton, the Oxford man, schoolteacher, who had insisted on living in a tent until the government relieved him of his job. He took to his tent, roamed the desert, drawn irresistibly, practical considerations of the present of no avail. This yearning took him, though he could never define the exact attraction. In the end, his mental balance was disturbed. "But now he's all right again. I saw him in London only this year. He can't say what he felt or why he did it. Only he's different." Of John Latin, too, he spoke, whom agoraphobia caught so terribly in Upper Egypt. Of Malahide, upon whom some fascination of the Nile induced suicidal mania and attempts at drowning. Of Jim Molson, a cousin, who had camped at Thebes with himself and Isley, whom megalomania of a most singular type attacked suddenly in a sandy waste, all radically cured as soon as they left Egypt, yet, one and all, changed and made otherwise in their very souls. He talked in a loose, disjointed way, and though much he said was fantastic, as if meant to challenge opposition, there was impressiveness about it somewhere, due, I think, to a kind of cumulative emotion he produced. "The monuments do not impress merely by their bulk, but by their majestic symmetry," I remember him saying. "Look at the choice of form alone. The pyramids, for instance. No other shape was possible. Dome, square, spires, all would have been hideously inadequate. The wedge-shaped mass, immense foundations, and pointed apex were the juste in outline. Do you think people without greatness in themselves chose that form? There was no unbalance in the minds that conceived the harmonious and magnificent structures of the temples. There was stately grandeur in their consciousness that could only be born of truth and knowledge. The power in their images is a direct expression of eternal and essential things they knew." We listened in silence. He was off upon his hobby. But behind the careless tone and laughing questions, there was this lurking passionateness that made me feel uncomfortable. He was edging up, I felt, toward some climax that meant life and death to himself and Isley. I could not fathom it. My sympathy let me in a little, yet not enough to understand completely. Isley, I saw, was also uneasy, though for reasons that equally evaded me. One can almost believe, he continued, that something still hangs about in the atmosphere from those olden times. He half closed his eyes, but I caught the gleam in them. It affects the mind through the imagination. With some, it changes the point of view. It takes the soul back with it to former, quite different conditions that must have been almost another kind of consciousness. He paused an instant and looked up at us. The intensity of belief in those days, he resumed, since neither of us accepted the challenge, was amazing, something quite unknown anywhere in the world today. It was so sure, so positive, no mere speculative theories, I mean, as though something in the climate, the exact position beneath the stars, the attitude of this particular stretch of earth in relation to the sun, thinned the veil between humanity and other things. Their hierarchies of gods, you know, were not mere idols, animals, birds, monsters, and what not, all typified spiritual forces and powers that influenced their daily life. But the strong thing is, they knew. People who were scientific as they were did not swallow foolish superstitions. They made colors that could last 6,000 years, even in the open air, and without instruments they measured accurately, in enormously difficult and involved calculation, the precession of the equinoxes. You've been to Denderah. He suddenly glanced again at me. No? Well, the minds that realized the zodiacal signs could hardly believe, you know, that Hathor was a cow. Isley coughed. He was about to interrupt, but before he could find the words, Molson was off again, some new quality in his tone and manner that was almost aggressive. The hints he offered seemed more than hints. There was a strange conviction in his heart. I think he was skirting a bigger thing than he and his companion knew, yet that his real object was to see in how far I was open to attack, how far my sympathy might be with them. I became aware that he and George Isley shared this bigger thing. It was based, I felt, on some certain knowledge that experiment had brought them. Think of the grand teaching of Akhenaten, the young pharaoh who regenerated the entire land and brought it to its immense prosperity. He taught the worship of the sun, but not of the visible sun. The deity had neither form nor shape. The great disk of glory was but the manifestation, each beneficent ray ending in a hand that blessed the world. It was a god of everlasting energy, love, and power, yet men could know it at first hand in their daily lives, worshipping it at dawn and sunset with passionate devotion. No anthropomorphic idol masqueraded in that. An extraordinary glow was about him as he said it. The same minute he lowered his voice, shifting the key perceptibly. He kept looking up at me through half-closed eyelids. And another thing they wonderfully knew, he almost whispered, was that with the procession of their deity across the equinoctial changes, there came new powers down into the world of men. Each cycle, each zodiacal sign, brought its special powers, which they quickly typified in the monstrous effigies we label today in our dull museums. Each sign took some 2,000 years to traverse. Each sign, moreover, involved a change in human consciousness. There was this relation between the heavens and the human heart. All that they knew. While the sun crawled through the sign of Taurus, it was the bull they worshipped. With Aries, it was the ram that coiffed their granite symbols. Then came, as you remember, with Pisces, the great new arrival, when already they sank from their grand zenith, and the fish was taken as the emblem of the changing powers which the Christ embodied. For the human soul, they held, echoed the changes in the immense journey of the original deity, who is its source across the zodiac, and the truth of, as above, so below, remains the key to all manifested life. And today, the sun, just entering Aquarius. New powers are close upon the world. The old, that which has been for 2,000 years, again is crumbling, passing, dying. New powers and a new consciousness are knocking at our doors. It is a time of change. It is also. He leaned forward so that his eyes came close before me. The time to make the change. The soul can choose its own conditions. It can. A sudden crash smothered the rest of the sentence. A chair had fallen with a clatter upon the wooden floor where the carpet left it bare. Whether Isley, in rising, had stumbled against it, or whether he had purposely knocked it over, I could not say. I only knew that he had abruptly risen, and as abruptly sat down again. A curious feeling came to me that the sign was somehow prearranged. It was so sudden. His voice, too, was forced, I thought. "Yes, but we can do without all that, Molson," he interrupted with acute abruptness. "Suppose we have a tune instead."